Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are looking at a ubiquitous cultural directive, one that is repeated by health writers, nutritionists, and well-meaning friends alike. I am talking about the assertion that we absolutely must drink eight-ounce glasses of water a day.
The infamous 8 by 8 rule. It really is everywhere, isn't it? I mean, you can barely walk through a gym or an office these days without seeing someone hauling around one of those giant gallon-sized motivational water bottles with the timestamps printed on the side telling them to, keep drinking.
Exactly. It has become so deeply ingrained in modern wellness culture that we rarely stop to actually question it. But the scientific basis for this specific rule is highly contested within the medical literature. Our discussion today focuses on a central, substantive disagreement that stems right from our source material on human hydration. Basically, the question is this: should healthy adults proactively force a high fluid intake for optimal health, or are the human body's natural thirst mechanisms entirely sufficient to maintain proper hydration? I will be making the case today that forcing yourself to chug water all day is an unscientific myth, and that ad libitum fluid consumption, which is just a clinical way of saying drinking when you are actually thirsty, is perfectly sufficient for human osmoregulation.
And I represent the perspective that while the literal 8 by 8 rule is indeed a historical accident, proactively maintaining a high fluid intake is critical. Because when we look at the data, scheduled proactive hydration is essential for slowing biological aging and preventing chronic disease over a human lifespan.
To understand why the 8 by 8 rule is fundamentally flawed, I really think we have to look at its origins. The requirement to aggressively consume 64 ounces of plain water daily. Well, it didn't come from a rigorous clinical trial. It is an urban myth born from a gross misinterpretation of a very old guideline.
Right, you're referring to the 1945 recommendation.
I am, yeah. In 1945, the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Research Council published a guideline recommending approximately 2.5 liters of water daily. They based this on a general metric of 1 milliliter of water for each calorie of food consumed. So, if you eat 2,500 calories, you need 2.5 liters of water.
Which mathematically works out to just about 84 ounces.
Right, which sounds like it totally supports the 8 by 8 rule. But people completely ignored the crucial caveat in the very next sentence of that report. It explicitly stated, and I quote, "Most of this quantity is contained in prepared foods." That single ignored sentence literally spawned an entirely unscientific obsession.
It is fascinating how a single dropped sentence can shape decades of consumer behavior.
It really is, and the scientific community has tried to correct the record for years. Dr. Heinz Valton, who is a prominent kidney specialist, published a seminal physiological review back in 2002. He exhaustively searched the literature, spending months just combing through the databases, and he found absolutely no scientific evidence supporting the 8 by 8 rule for healthy, sedentary adults in temperate climates. We really have to respect the exquisite precision of the human osmoregulatory system. That is our internal water accounting system. By relying on antidiuretic hormone and the natural sensation of thirst, our bodies are perfectly capable of maintaining fluid balance. The rigid prescription of 8 glasses of water just isn't medical dogma. It is an arbitrary target that ignores the reality of human biology.
I will definitely concede that the literal 8 by 8 rule is pretty flimsy when you look at the history. The origins are murky, and it is certainly an oversimplification. I don't think any serious modern physiologist is defending the magic number of 64 ounces of plain water. However, completely dismissing the value of high fluid intake just because of that historical quirk is, I think, a dangerous overcorrection.
How so? If the rule is a myth, isn't returning to our natural thirst mechanism the logical correction?
Well, it sounds logical, but when we look at modern, longitudinal data, a very different picture emerges regarding what it means to be truly hydrated. Think about the 2023 study published in eBiomedicine, which is part of the Lancet Discovery Science Suite. They didn't just look at a few people over a weekend. They analyzed over 11,000 adults across a 25-year period.
That is a massive cohort. How were they even tracking hydration over 2.5 decades without relying on notoriously inaccurate, self-reported water tracking?
That is exactly the brilliance of the study. They used fasting serum sodium levels as a proxy for long-term hydration status. Serum sodium is essentially a measure of how concentrated your blood is. And their findings definitively prove that adequate hydration, which just means avoiding acute symptomatic dehydration, is not the same thing as optimal hydration.
So they found a difference between just surviving and actually thriving?
Exactly. When fasting serum sodium levels operate at the higher end of the normal range, specifically above 142 milliequivalents per liter, individuals experience a 10 to 15% increased odds of accelerated biological aging. Even more alarming, operating at this higher normal range correlates with a 64% increased risk of developing chronic diseases like heart failure and dementia, and it brings a 21% higher risk of premature death. What this essentially means is that running your body dry isn't just making you thirsty, it is quietly acting as an accelerator pedal for biological aging. Relying solely on the sensation of thirst is relying on an acute survival mechanism. It is designed to keep you alive today, not to serve as a strategy for long-term physiological optimization over decades.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the reliability of our internal physiology. It is extraordinarily difficult to believe that evolutionary biology would leave humans with a chronic water deficit that constantly requires forced, scheduled fluid intake.
You think evolution perfected the system?
I think the homeostatic mechanisms of our osmoreceptors and vasopressin are fine-tuned to an astonishing degree. If we were constantly living in a state of perilous underhydration just by following our natural thirst, our species would not have thrived. We also cannot ignore the very real risks of overriding these mechanisms. Proactively forcing fluids when the body does not demand them can lead to overhydration. In severe cases, this causes water intoxication or hyponatremia, where the sodium in your blood becomes dangerously diluted. Hyponatremia
Is certainly real, but it is typically seen in extreme scenarios, like marathon runners chugging gallons of water without electrolytes.
true. But the mindset of more is always better pushes everyday people toward unnecessary extremes. Furthermore, we really have to scrutinize the source of this perpetual cultural push for proactive hydration. The literature points directly to industry influence. In 2011, the British Medical Journal published a highly critical piece by Dr. Margaret McCartney, targeting the Hydration for Health initiative.
I am familiar with that initiative. They were pushing for 1.5 to 2.0 liters of daily water consumption, right?
Exactly. But what the BMJ highlighted was that this initiative was created and sponsored by Danone, the massive multinational manufacturer of major bottled water brands like Evian and Volvic. The narrative of silent dehydration is frequently manufactured to sell bottled water. It doesn't reflect a genuine physiological deficit in the general population. We are being sold a cure for a disease we do not have.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why relying purely on evolutionary thirst mechanisms falls short in a modern context, regardless of what bottled water companies are doing for their marketing. Yes, the osmoregulatory system is elegant, but it is fundamentally flawed in several ways, particularly as we age.
Flawed how?
Thirst is one of the most primal drives we possess. It is when you are 20. But it is a well-documented clinical reality that older adults lose their thirst cues. The neuroendocrine reflexes governing the desire to drink blunt significantly over time. This is exactly why dehydration is one of the leading causes of hospital admissions for the elderly. We cannot just tell an aging population to drink when they are thirsty, because the signal is broken, the dashboard warning light has burned out.
I agree that the elderly population faces unique challenges. But what about the general healthy adult population?
Even in younger populations, we have to look at the endocrinology of habitual, low-volume drinkers. These are individuals who naturally just don't feel the urge to drink much fluid. If you run a basic lab panel on them, their plasma osmolality might look perfectly normal. They appear, on paper, to be hydrated.
Because their bodies are doing exactly what they are supposed to do, conserving water to maintain that balance.
Yes, but at what cost? To maintain that normal osmolality with low fluid intake, their bodies have to constantly pump out arginine vasopressin, or AVP, that is the hormone telling the kidneys to hoard water, alongside stress hormones like cortisol. They are perpetually forcing the kidneys to concentrate urine, which is a state of chronic hormonal stress. The literature increasingly shows that this chronic release of AVP and stress hormones contributes heavily to the development of metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and obesity. Evolution gave us a system to survive a drought. It did not intend for us to trigger that drought survival stress response every single day of our lives just because we are too busy at our desks to drink a glass of water.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the entire premise of the 8x8 myth and the subsequent panic over low-volume drinking relies on a false vilification of the diverse ways humans actually consume water.
What do you mean by a false vilification?
Well, the directive implies that if you aren't carrying a heavy bottle of plain water everywhere, you are doing damage. This ignores the vast array of beverages and foods that successfully hydrate us. For decades, the public was told that caffeinated beverages actively dehydrate them. How many times have you heard someone say, "Coffee doesn't count, it is a diuretic"?
It is a very common belief, yes.
But rigorous clinical trials have entirely dismantled that claim. Studies show that for habitual consumers, caffeine's mild diuretic effect is completely neutralized. A randomized controlled trial of men drinking moderate amounts of coffee showed absolutely no significant differences in total body water or urinary biomarkers compared to those drinking an equivalent volume of plain water. A cup of coffee is quite literally a cup of water with some bean extract in it.
That is fair. The anti-caffeine hydration myth has been largely debunked for habitual drinkers.
Furthermore, look at the Beverage Hydration Index, or the BHI. When researchers test how well the body retains fluids, carbohydrate electrolyte solutions, and even milk consistently outperform plain water. Milk empties from the stomach slower and keeps you hydrated longer. And we haven't even touched on food. When we account for the 20 to 30% of water we get from our meals, the water inside an apple, a bowl of soup, or a serving of spinach, plus the fluids from our morning coffee or afternoon tea, the vast majority of people are effortlessly achieving osmotic balance. They are doing this without forcing down arbitrary quotas of plain water.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the metabolic costs associated with obtaining your baseline hydration from those alternative sources?
Metabolic costs? You mean calories?
Calories are part of it, yes, but I am talking about something deeper. I fully acknowledge that the water inside an apple or the water in a cup of coffee counts toward your total fluid volume. The physics of water balance dictates that it must, but the biological cost of processing those fluids is entirely different. This brings us to the concept of renal solute load.
The workload placed on the kidneys to clear waste.
Exactly. Think of renal solute load as the cleanup cost of a beverage or a meal. When you rely on foods, milk, or sweetened beverages for hydration, you are simultaneously ingesting calories, proteins, and sodium. Let's say you eat a highly salty, protein-heavy meal. Diets high in protein and sodium significantly increase the obligatory urine volume required to excrete waste products, like urea nitrogen.
Right, your body needs water to flush those solutes out.
Precisely. If you drink a beverage with a high solute load, your kidneys have to work harder and use more water to filter and clear those solutes. It is like trying to wash a muddy car with muddy water. So, while a glass of milk might have a favorable beverage hydration index in the short term because it digests slowly, relying on complex, nutrient-dense fluids for your baseline hydration places an unnecessary metabolic tax on the renal system.
But the kidneys are designed to filter. That is their primary function.
They are, but why overwork them? Plain water remains the absolute most efficient, calorie-free vehicle to lower serum sodium and support kidney filtration. It allows the body to clear waste without introducing additional solutes that the body then has to spend energy managing. You avoid that heavy, lethargic feeling that comes with an overworked system.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. What you are describing, using high volumes of plain water to aggressively flush the kidneys and manage specific solute loads, is a targeted clinical intervention. It is a medical therapy, not a baseline lifestyle rule for the general healthy public.
I wouldn't call drinking plain water a medical therapy. It is just basic hygiene for your internal organs.
But the data you are leaning on often comes from pathological states. We see this clearly in the treatment of nephrolithiasis, or kidney stones. A Cochrane systematic review demonstrated that for individuals with a history of kidney stones, pushing fluid intake to achieve 2.0 liters of daily urine output reduces the risk of stone recurrence by an impressive 55%.
55% is a massive reduction for a non-pharmacological intervention.
It is. It is a highly effective treatment for a specific pathology, but projecting that level of forced, high-volume fluid intake onto the healthy population is an overreach. When we blur the line between disease management and general wellness, we generate unnecessary anxiety and guilt among people who are perfectly healthy but fail to meet an arbitrary hydration quota.
I don't think it is about guilt. It is about optimizing health span.
But there are secondary harms to this cultural obsession. Forcing people to drink 8 glasses of water often leads to the massive consumption of bottled water. That directly exposes a population to microplastics, phthalates, and bisphenol A from the plastic packaging. Not to mention the sheer inconvenience and disruption of frequent unnecessary urination throughout the workday. We are treating healthy people as if they are sick patients who need a constant IV drip of hydration.
I come at it from a different way. The very distinction you are drawing between healthy and at risk is an illusion when we look at health across a lifespan.
An illusion? How so? We clearly know the difference between someone with a history of kidney stones and someone without.
Of course we do in acute cases, but the entire point of the Lancet longitudinal study I mentioned earlier is that subclinical, silent underhydration operates entirely beneath the surface of what we consider healthy. You do not feel your serum sodium creeping up to 143 milliequivalents per liter. You don't wake up feeling your arginine vasopressin gently elevating.
Well, because the body's compensating.
Exactly. It compensates. But over decades, that low-grade physiological stress gradually damages the endothelial lining of the cardiovascular system and overworks the delicate renal architecture. We should not view proactive hydration merely as a post-hoc treatment for someone who has already developed a kidney stone. That is closing the barn door after the horse has bolted.
So you view it purely as a preventative measure?
Yes, it is a highly accessible, safe, and effective preventative measure. By deliberately maintaining a higher intake of plain fluids, we suppress those stress hormones. We keep serum sodium in the lower, safer ranges, ideally between 138 and 140 milliequivalents per liter, where the risk of chronic disease is empirically at its lowest. Aging inevitably degrades our physiological reserves. Why wouldn't we use a simple tool like scheduled fluid intake to preserve our organ function rather than waiting until the damage manifests as heart failure or chronic kidney disease in our 70s?
As we draw to a close, my position remains grounded in the remarkable efficiency of human physiology. For the vast majority of healthy adults, the internal mechanisms of thirst and renal filtration are entirely sufficient. We do not need to micromanage our fluid intake or succumb to the arbitrary rule of 64 ounces of plain water a day.
Even knowing the long-term beta on serum sodium?
Even knowing that data, because I believe the body's compensations are natural and robust. A normal, varied diet containing water-rich foods, alongside our preferred beverages like coffee and tea, effortlessly fulfills our hydration needs without the metabolic tax you are worried about. We should trust our biological cues, drink when we are thirsty, and free ourselves from the manufactured guilt and commercial influence that sustains the 8x8 myth.
And my summary is that while we can completely discard the simplistic 8x8 rule as a mid-century artifact, the modern evidence firmly points to the benefits of proactive, scheduled fluid intake. The epidemiological data is clear. Running the human engine on minimal fluid triggers hormonal stress pathways that accelerate biological aging and invite chronic disease.
So you are advocating for a conscious effort rather than just waiting for the thirst signal.
Absolutely. Optimizing our serum sodium levels through deliberate, mindful hydration is not medicalizing wellness. It is a vital, preventative tool to preserve our health span, protect our kidneys and heart, and mitigate the inevitable physiological decline of aging. It is about giving your body the raw materials it needs so it doesn't have to work so hard.
I believe we have reached some meaningful points of convergence today. We entirely agree that the literal 8x8 metric is scientifically unfounded. We also agree that true hydration requirements are deeply individualized based on age, diet, and activity levels.
Indeed, and it is clear that understanding this topic requires looking through both an acute physiological lens, how the body brilliantly manages water minute to minute,
as well as a long-term epidemiological lens regarding how our daily fluid intake impacts our lifespan over decades.
There is certainly much more to explore in the source material regarding the fascinating complexities of fluid electrolyte balance. We will leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence and form your own conclusion on how best to hydrate.